Good afternoon. This is Dennis Donahue, the Director of Western Growers Center for Innovation and Technology in Salinas, California. And welcome to another webinar where we're talking about the challenges of innovation in challenging times. And we have with us today the CEO and founder of Concentric Power, Brian Curtis. We're always particularly delighted to welcome Brian because he's a hometown kid, a cowboy making good. And so, Brian, welcome and good to see you.
Thank you. Great to be here. For those that are concerned, we're social distancing. Dennis and I are in the same office, but in separate rooms.
And make sure we've got plexiglass in between us. And I think we're well. I think we'd have to get a couple first downs to get close to each other. So yeah. So thank you for pointing that out. And you know, Brian, we're gonna talk a little. Obviously, we're gonna talk about Concentric Power, but really the context and the backdrop that we want to do that is, you know, you have a focus with Concentric Power, and we want to talk about that. But we also want to talk about how is the pandemic and the challenges of COVID-19 changed or altered what you're doing, or has it, or perhaps everything's a steady go. So with all of that, I'll turn it over to you and start. Feel free to start sharing some of the challenges you're facing now.
Great. Yeah, no, thanks for the introduction, and thanks for putting this all together. As I mentioned, we're in the same office. This is only the second day I've been back to the office since this started out. But you know, real briefly for Concentric, it's just like everybody else. It's been disruptive in terms of how we run the business day to day. Our office staff has been working from home. Our field technicians still need to be in the field to make sure things are working. So we've had to adjust internal communications, external communications, and everything else. So this is interesting times to be doing webinars and everything else. Thank you for putting it together. Just a real brief introduction of Concentric Power for those of you who might not know much about us. We are developing. Let me flip ahead with slides here a little bit. We're developing microgrid projects with a focus on the ag industry and communities that also serve the ag industry. So what that really means is we've got a technology platform that integrates distributed energy resources, to use an industry term, or DERs, and we build, own, operate, and maintain these systems for our customers. We also have a version of that where we can own the assets with zero cost out of pocket for the customers and sell you power. So that's what we're doing. We're a technology driven company. So we've got a technology platform, but we also focus a lot on real practical solutions that are ready to deploy now. We're also a mission driven company with the focus on getting all of our customers ultimately to 100% renewable. That's our big mission over time. But again, being very practical in how we get from here to there. We'll talk a little bit about how the mission for the company has helped us through the crisis times and giving us a little bit of a guiding light on how we go from here. So with that being said, this is kind of the engineer in me, but there's a metaphor that's been rolling around in my head through this whole thing, which is a lot of what we do as Concentric is about energy resilience, especially lately. The company's been around for going on 10 years now, and we've always focused on three main things. It's energy cost, energy independence, and sustainability. And within that is resilience and reliability, especially as part of the energy independence piece of it. And this really was an emphasis for us just before the crisis hit, with everything that's been going on in California with wildfire power outages and all that sort of stuff. We really saw an alignment of everything we've been working on, and we were starting to hit stride on the company. and the market dynamics were really good. And so this metaphor that's been going on in my mind is we've been focused on electric power resilience, and to me, going through a company, how we manage the company, how we manage customer relationships, supplier relationships have been important as well. But to go a little bit deeper on the analogy, when you think about power infrastructure and power quality and energy resilience, you can think about it in long duration ways. If you have the power out for several days or weeks, depending on what's going on, you've got to solve for that. There's medium duration, and then there's short duration, which is the immediate, sometimes literally fires you're putting out. And in the case of electric power, you get into sub 1 second granularity sometimes as well. And so when I think about running the company and getting through all of this, I'm thinking about what are the immediate things that are happening, what are the medium term, and what are the long term things. And the main theme that I've come up with is, especially for Concentric, and every company is going to be different and have different dynamics, but the long range fundamentals in our assessment have stayed solid, but the short and medium term aspects of it may be changing. And so we've had to do a lot of, and we do this on the engineering side for technical resilience, a lot of scenario planning, and that's been true on the business side as well. So that's just been sort of to kind of tie it together and be a little bit of a nerdy engineer about it. That's how I think about the company as well. And at the end of the day, a lot of what's going to get us from here to there to keep to the theme of the webinar here is being able to innovate across the board, not just engineering wise, but business model wise, organization wise, and be able to manage through that. So that's
Brian, before you move along, because we had a chance to visit a little bit before we got started, I think that's an interesting point that you make about the importance of organizational resilience, and you as a CEO as a leader of your own company, because obviously your team's going to be looking to you, because when something like this order of magnitude hits, I mean it's sometimes it's pretty tough mentally to still be riding tall in the saddle, so to speak. So you as you said, you've been around for a number of years, so you have some organizational stability, but I think underscoring and maybe an observation about that point in terms of how important it is for startups to not only be thinking about capital and marketplace access, but in order to get those things, leadership of some sort is really going to matter, it sounds like.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's been an interesting ride. Again, just like everybody else, we've been going through the ups and downs of this, where up front back in March, it was really interesting. Is this real? I mean, is this really happening? Are we really sending everybody home? And how long is it going to be? How long is it going to take? I just remember, right at the front end, there was all kinds of questions about, all right, well, what does this mean for the company? What does this mean for me personally? Not me, but each employee was asking that same question to themselves, and giving some direction. And I'm not saying we had a crystal ball. Nobody did or does. But starting to frame up, okay, what does this mean for us? How does it change, if anything, how we're working? And then as we kind of kept going through it, we've seen some of our competitors lay people off. We're and we'll get into this a little bit. Our assessment is we should be doubling down right now. So that's been interesting, where some of the reactions have been, and very much out of necessity in many cases, pulling back. I think where we're looking at, the way we're looking at it is we're really leaning into the situation here, and maybe this is just the eternal optimist in me, but I am optimistic on how things are going to play coming out of it. Again, I know this is different for every industry and every company, but we've been a little bit fortunate in that perspective, from that perspective.
Well, I think optimism is certainly appreciated where warranted these days. So that's a good note. So I'll turn it back over to you. But I thought that was kind of an important point to underscore. A lot of times there's a focus on the product, understand capital, market access, but those intangibles are important right now as well.
Yeah. Yeah, no, the innovation, the way I look at innovation in a time like this is we've got technical innovation. That's kind of the obvious one. So we're working on that as we always do. There's innovation around capital structure and structured finance. We're a little bit fortunate to the extent that our industry sort of inherently has a creative structured finance aspect to it, and we embrace that a lot. So that's been good. And then there's the management side of it. So with that being said, I'll flip to the next slide, which has also been, if I can, let's see if I can make that work. And this is being mission driven, I would say, and I guess this kind of falls under the banner of leadership, but being mission driven has helped to give a guiding light for a lot of what we're doing. So our mission at Concentric is to create a pathway for our customers to get to zero carbon operations and providing energy independence and resilience today. So again, that goes back to the sort of long-term view, but also really practical. What can we do today? And in times of crisis, remembering what the big long-term vision is and mission is obviously important, or maybe not obvious, but also being able to focus on today. So I try to keep this in mind for myself. So those are kind of two overarching frameworks that I think about in times like these. So with that being said, what I thought I'd talk a little bit about is some of the areas that we looked at and have been really central to our business plan going back through the history of the company, but some of the big trends and strategies that we had in place even 3 months ago. Once you get into a crisis like this, at least the way I look at it is we have to go back and revisit the assumptions and be really self-aware on what has changed or what hasn't changed. And change can be good or bad, or maybe just totally different. But again, sort of thinking about it as an engineer, for better or for worse, that's how I think about stuff. You got to look at what is the design intent, and what are the assumptions that go into the design that you're putting in place for a given project or solution. And as long as you really understand deeply the design intent and deeply understand the assumptions that go into it, then that sets you off in the right direction. And then ultimately, if you have all the fundamentals sound there, then you can start to think out of the box and be really innovative. So with that being said, just to get specific about Concentric and how we're looking at things as a case study, we had a few big trends and strategies that we had identified before COVID-19. So the first was the power grid and infrastructure are really at the front edge of a technology and regulatory revolution. And this is being played out in distributed generation, renewables, and controls and automation. So some of the technology platform that we've developed and patents that we have around artificial intelligence and machine learning for management of networks of energy assets. So that was a big mega trend that we saw and we've been building our company around. Secondly, on the project finance side of things, microgrid projects and some of the components of those projects are really emerging, even in the last year, have emerged as an established asset class. That's a new thing that wasn't true when I started the company, where at the time, in the early days, talking to investors, it was, all right, this is a one-off thing we have to figure out and understand and deconstruct to see if it's the kind of thing we want to invest in. Fast forward a little bit, and I like to think we were part of this progression. Is these types of projects are now becoming established and well understood, which is great. So I mean, it's good for us, but it's good for our competition. It's good for the whole industry to have sort of a common understanding of what these assets can do. So that was it's still emerging, but that was really beginning to be true first part of this year. And then along with that is going back to our mission of getting to 100% renewable or 100% carbon free. Even a couple of years ago, or even last year, I would say the viability of that within any sort of time frame was really an open question. And I've been really convinced, and a lot of it is driven by some of the costs of some of the components coming way down. And the last bullet point in terms of having lower cost of capital as a result of the establishment of the asset class. So between technology, costs, and finance, there really is a viable pathway to get to 100% renewable. It's not going to happen overnight, but I feel strongly that that's happening. So those were kind of the big fundamental things before the crisis. Coming out of it, and revisiting those assumptions, looking at, okay, first one, the grid is in the middle of a revolution. Okay, is that still true? One thing I would say on the technology side is there's going to be, and we're already seeing this, is a further emphasis on controls and automation and remote operations of a lot of these distributed assets, which is something that has been central to our technology roadmap from the beginning. So that actually reinforces what we were already doing. So that's a good thing. Again, not every company in the world right now is getting reinforcing messages from the market, but in this case, it's working out well. So the conclusion for us has been doubling down on the development of that platform and going deeper into, and I've got another slide on this in terms of our peer-to-peer controls, which work well for exactly that. The second conclusion, as it relates to the regulatory side of this, is there was, especially in California, California has been a leader on this, but it's popping up around the country as well, legislation and rulemaking already in progress that is, in my opinion, or from where I sit, looks like it's going to be accelerating out of the crisis here. So the conclusion for us is get deeper into the process and engage in Sacramento earlier rather than later, especially as different stimulus or recovery packages, a better way to say it, may come through Fed, state, local level, and really engaging on that now and innovating around on how those regulations and rulemaking play out. So that's going to be a big part of what we focus on through the rest of this year and into next year.
And Brian, and somebody in the audience asked the question, how has technology kept things moving? And it sounds like pre-COVID, where we are right now, for lack of a better word, the transition was already underway and technology was driving that. So just the technology has a certain momentum of its own, and there's no turning back. Is that kind of a fair assessment of quote unquote how technology has helped keep you moving, or lead you to the conclusion we're going to double down? Is that a fair assessment, or are there some other elements to how technology has kept things moving?
Yeah, no, I would say technology as a thing definitely has some momentum of its own, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's a foregone conclusion that it's always going to be moving forward or quickly. I think different aspects of the economy, whether it's the private sector, companies like us, or academia or government, all play a role in that technology. And I would say it's not necessarily, the outcome isn't necessarily that it's going to keep going forward fast. In my opinion, I think from a private sector side of things, if you've got the right vision, now is a good time to, especially as we've had to sort of retreat into shelter in place sort of stuff. It's actually a good time to spend more time building those platforms and getting established, because frankly, just like everybody else, sales or the forecast for sales in the next year is different than they were than what we had in January. I'm optimistic that things are going to kind of bounce back in our sector at least, but it is a good time to sort of get our technology house in order and be able to go out to market aggressively. So I think technology is helping propel some of this, and I think if you've got a good technology roadmap, that can help guide you through it.
So that's the real message around technology. Whatever it is, sharpen it up, focus it, and get that roadmap right.
Yeah, I mean that's the way I look at it, and and as sort of the recurring theme here is, if you've got your roadmap that you believed in before the crisis, make sure you've really double checked and went back and reassessed your assumptions, because some of those assumptions most likely have changed, which may change how that roadmap sort of evolves. But if you've got a good starting point, that's really helpful to keep going on it. So
good, thank you.
Yeah. I didn't put a lot of slides in the deck on our actual technology. That's probably a topic for another webinar. But just real briefly, what we're focused on is a peer-to-peer microgrid control type system. And the idea there is to be able to have a flexible and scalable system, not just for a single site, but for a network of sites, being able to do aggregated power controls, whether that's aggregated supply or aggregated demand, and being able to manage those things on a large scale in a really flexible technology way that allows you to sort of have a future-proofed system, both in terms of new technologies that come on over time, to the extent that these systems are their infrastructure at the end of the day, and so they're long-lived assets. But technology is going to change over the next 25 years, and being able to deal with that, but also especially the sectors that we focus on, which is ag and industrial, is the facilities that we're at are sort of living beings. They're changing and growing and shrinking and just morphing over time, and we've got to have systems that fit that bill. So the architecture that we've really put together takes all that into account. And as it relates to the sort of crisis right now, it actually plays well into that, where we've got some customers that are scaling back. Okay, we can modify and manage that. We've got others that are growing. So that's been helpful to have that sort of flexible architecture. Next slide. Don't want to spend a ton of time on this either, but this is to the point of being able to be aware of the existing policy frameworks and legislative frameworks that exist, and being actively engaged is, I think, going to be the name of the game as we go through this. I don't think sitting back and hoping it gets worked out right is a good strategy. So the conclusion has really been let's engage and be a part of it.
So we do have a question asking, do you see the regulatory environment remaining as challenging as it has been, or is there likely to be some adaptation really from the state where, in real time, if we're kind of, for lack of a better phrase, in a period of however long it does or doesn't last, some suspended animation? Is there going to be any flex, or from the state standpoint, steady go, in which case, to your point, engage? Yeah,
I think there's going to be a lot of disruption. Things are going to be changing. I mean, we're heading into, assuming we get through the health crisis, crisis part of this, we're going to be heading into, well, we're already there, an economic crisis that is going to be managed at federal level, state level, local level, within the private sector. So I think all of those factors are going to play into sort of priorities for governments and more importantly, the people that they serve. So that's going to change, I think, sort of priorities and what gets attention. I think, again, we're a little bit fortunate here to the extent that what we do at Concentric, sustainable infrastructure, is a good match for economic development and being able to help cities. And we look at this really from the local level. And those are the kinds of projects that we're working on, where we're engaging with local cities, municipalities, community choice aggregators like Monterey Bay Community Power, and engaging on that local level and helping be part of the economic recovery through sustainable infrastructure is something that it's always been part of our strategy, but is I think going to be an important aspect of where we're going.
Well, you've always had an eye on 2045 and that long-term view. I would imagine you were not displeased to see the governor's 80-person task force, headed by Tom Steyer, with a very clear statement that we want to be high value, clean tech, heading in that same direction of the roadmap you've always had in mind.
Yeah, 2045 is one of the dates that's been put out there by, or not just put out there, but really rallied around by the state of California. Again, is one of the leading markets on renewable portfolio standards, the RPS standards, and other activities. So yeah, no, California has been really leading the charge on a lot of this, and it's nice that it's home base for us. It's been a good market to get our first toehold as kind of a startup and get going through all this. The environment here in California, from that perspective, is good for us. That's not to say there aren't regulatory challenges, or there's a lot there to navigate. But yeah, no, it's not bad.
Okay. Carry on. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, please do. So moving on. On the finance side of it, this has been actually really interesting, and I would say it was not clear at all as this thing was sort of evolving, starting in March, how the finance world would play out. Obviously, there's been a ton of volatility in the stock market, so public equities have been way down and bounced way back, and just a lot of volatility there. At the same time, interest rates are at all-time lows. And when you kind of add all those things up, it's actually not a bad recipe for project finance for good revenue-driven, asset-based infrastructure projects, which is what we do. So again, a little bit fortunate here that what we're doing actually is reinforced by the macroeconomics. One aspect to get into the details of it that has really changed quite a bit is a lot of our projects have tax incentives associated with them and tax credits. So to the extent that 6 months ago we were in the middle of one of the biggest rallies, and everybody had profits. Not everybody, but there was tax appetite in the world. A lot of that has changed. So some of the assumptions around what's available in terms of tax motivated investment, that's a moving target. But at the end of the day, the conclusion that we've come to is it's not a terrible time to be putting in bigger capital programs with the anticipation that there's going to be sort of a rebound coming out of the crisis and infrastructure getting built. So I would say that that was a conclusion. I wasn't sure how that was going to play out, and so far so good. And we're all still in the middle of this, obviously, but in the spirit of the innovation, I would say one conclusion for sure here is that it's not just going to be off the shelf financing structures. There's going to be creativity and innovation going on in that respect as well. So that's something that we spend a lot of time thinking about. And then, as I mentioned already, just on a sort of economic note, economic development is going to be really key to recovery here. And as I said, we're going to be engaging early and more broadly than we have to date with a lot of the local communities that have a need for good, reliable, low-cost power. So that's a big part of our strategy. And then on the third bullet point, in terms of the viable pathways to get to 100% renewable, I would say one of the assumptions that has changed here is that there's in our conversations with customers right now is that there's less focus on sustainability and more focus on just making sure their core business is solid and they're in a good footing to come out of all this. But we also believe this is a short-term phenomenon. I think sustainability is an important trend factor, however you want to say it, that is driving some level of decision making. Our conclusion, again, sort of reinforcing what we were already thinking about, is that central to our design criteria is that the economics have to work and the technology has to work. It's got to be reliable. It's got to be low cost. And if that doesn't happen, then the sustainability doesn't happen. So the key in the viability of renewables is all the economics. So that just sort of, again, reinforces our perspective on it. So that's really all I had in terms of slides. I'll pause there. And Dennis, I think you had a few other topics. And
well, we do have a few other questions, and we'll capture those in a second here. But before we do, in your concluding statement, you talked about zero carbon industry, and and even though you're in the facility side rather than necessarily in the field, you're around the ag community. Do we think enough about the whole carbon footprint? I mean, obviously it's tied into sustainability, but that idea of the zero carbon industry is that something we should be thinking more about as an industry, or all in due time it'll get here, because a lot of that stuff's on the books, it's coming. Should we be more conscious of that?
Right. The short answer is yes, but to give some credit to the ag communities that we focus on, there's a natural fit there where I would say you can go back 100 years and there's a fit between looking out for the environment and sustainability and making your living off the land, right? There's a direct tie there. So I think it's sort of inherent to the industry, just it's kind of how we're wired. But having said that, I think some of the deadlines and the regulations that come out of it, some of the unintended consequences of putting in place aggressive renewable targets, namely in the form of increased cost of power. If you look at the cost of electricity in California compared to Texas or other places in the country, it's really shocking, actually. And in a lot of ways, the industries that are here in California are here because this is where the resources are, whether those are human resources or actual natural resources like farming land. So I think being aware of those things is going to be pretty critical to long range planning. And I would say the other aspect that I'm guessing the audience here today is very well aware of this, but the customers that the ag industry serves are all over the country, and a lot of them are large corporations or even school districts and everybody that's eating fresh vegetables or meat, dairy, poultry, all that stuff. So there's a lot of drivers coming from those end customers that are already part of the strategy and the planning. So I would say the industry is very well aware of it. I think there's always more detailed planning to do, and it's going to evolve over time. And the actual timing of some of it may not be perfectly predictable, but I would say by and large, there's pretty good awareness already. And like I said, it's sort of a natural tendency to think about it.
Well, one of the questions we've got is, and I think this is a bit of a segue to it. What's your general observation being out there among them, so to speak, in terms of an appetite for innovation? Is that diminished? Are folks more risk adverse right now, or still interested in innovation, but just from a practical standpoint, whether it's capital, because your projects are big projects, but what's your general take on innovation? The industry keenly interested, but slow down a little bit, or what's the patient's temperature on this?
Yeah, I would say I'll say this first. The ag industry that I've gotten to know that doesn't really do innovation just for fun. They do innovation to solve problems and really advance their business, whether it's for competitive reasons or to grow their business or stave off a downturn or whatever it is. So I think in that spirit, the fact that there's disruption and some portions of it are really hurting as food consumption changes from restaurants to home and everything else. So in that sense, I think there's a lot of people trying to innovate and really just do whatever it takes and be creative to figure out how to reinvent themselves if they need to, or if it's whatever the factors are for different individual companies or farms or processors. They're being super innovative. So I think that's always been how I've seen the market. There's always folks that like to be way out there and cutting edge and take some risks, and that may take a different course over the immediate term. But even within that, I think what I'm seeing is a lot of those customers are doubling down as well. So I think innovation is alive and well, if not more important during a crisis.
No, I think that's well said. I mean, just like you made some comments about kind of the the intersection of environment and conservation and farming and a way of life. I think what characterizes the folks I know, that same group of growers and processors, besides many other things, at the heart, they're problem solvers. And so if you've got a problem to solve, that'll keep driving innovation. So that's a great comment on your part. The other question that we've gotten is, you talked a little bit about partnerships with local governments, and you mentioned community power. Are there a couple of other examples of local government that you might want to point out for folks in the audience that either you've been involved in or you're aware of? Sure.
Yeah. I think you might be hinting at a project we're working on with the city of Gonzales, which is a microgrid project for the industrial park down there. We were selected back in November for that, and we're getting into the details of it, or have been just deep into it over the last 6 months. And what's interesting, I got to give the city of Gonzales props on this. They were several steps ahead. This is anecdotal, not related to power, but I would say a really cool story I heard about Gonzales, not story, this is happening, is they had invested in and put together some partnerships to get high-speed internet to every resident in town. And I don't know if they were 100% through that project. They might have been, but prior to all of this. And so when shelter in place came along and all of a sudden everyone in town was home and on Zoom calls and doing education from home and everything else, they were prepared for it. So what's been great in working with the city there is, just like all of our projects, we've had to make sure that this project's still moving forward. And the message we got from the city is, look, innovation and investing in forward-thinking infrastructure has been sort of a hallmark for our city, and they've gotten awards for it, and they've just really been well positioned, and they're thinking the same way about energy, about wastewater treatment, all of the things that cities do. They've been really innovative and ahead of the curve on getting those things set up. So we've been really fortunate to have a chance to work with them. I think they're going to be, held up as a good example, especially on the power industry side of things. What they're doing really exemplifies what some of the legislation was built for, that I was referring to earlier. So I think there's going to be a lot more cities like that are taking proactive moves to really be in a good position as a city, not just power, but for infrastructure in general, whether it's communication, water, streets, all that stuff.
Well, any final thoughts as we wrap up? I think it's fair to say nobody's standing still during this moment in time.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. The only thing I would really add is, we're trying to accelerate through it, and whether it's on the technology side, on the organization side, on the finance side of things, we're cautiously optimistic on what a recovery looks like. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, we're doing scenario planning every which way and making sure we're prepared for it, whatever might come out. But I think there's innovation built into every piece of that.
Sounds good. Well, it's always good to catch up with what you're doing, and we appreciate it. And I'll kind of close and by reminding folks we'll be back next week with another webinar with one of the center residents. We're working with over 50 residents right now, and we've got folks who want to talk to the outside world, as it were, and kind of share their story. Already booked through October, and I think you brought up a good point. The way this unfolded, it was kind of day by day and then week by week, and how, when, and where shelter in place ends, and we begin to pass through the various phases. It's fair to say this is going to be an ongoing story. So a challenging time in early May may be different than July and October, but I think it's fair to say it's going to be challenging for a while. So we want to invite folks back next week. And Brian, thanks for your time, and good to see you on the screen and in the back office from a safe, socially distant space.
Likewise. Thanks for having me today.
You bet. Thanks, Brian. Have a good day.
Okay.